Welcome to How Brands Are Built, where branding professionals get into the details of what they do and how they do it. I'm your host, Rob Meyerson. Thanks for listening. Today's episode is brought to you by SquadHelp, the world's #1 naming platform. To use SquadHelp and launch a naming contest today, go to squadhelp.com and start receiving custom name suggestions instantly. This season is all about brand positioning, and today I'm talking to someone who introduced another important term into the branding lexicon, challenger brand. My guest is Adam Morgan, author of Eating the Big Fish: How Challenger Brands Can Compete Against Brand Leaders. Adam is also the founder of eatbigfish, a renowned marketing consultancy that works with clients to develop their own breakthrough strategies. I asked Adam just what a challenger brand is and how his thinking on the topic has evolved over the almost 20 years since he first wrote that book. We got into the relationship between challenger brand thinking and positioning more generally, and Adam offered up a couple of specific exercises any brand can use to challenge how they think about their category and their role within it. Here's the conversation with Adam. Adam Morgan, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for asking me.
So you wrote Eating the Big Fish back in 1999, and the subtitle of that book is How Challenger Brands Can Compete Against Brand Leaders. So just to get us started, what is a challenger brand?
So I define a challenger brand as clearly something about, primarily about mindset and attitude rather than state of market. So simply because you're a second or third or fourth ranked brand doesn't make you a challenger. Lots of people will say that it does, but it doesn't. It's really about, do you have business ambitions that are bigger than your conventional marketing resources? And are you prepared to do something bold and ambitious to kind of close the implications of that gap? I was also, when I was researching, quite clearly looking at brands that had grown, that were profitable, and that were kind of financially robust, because I wanted to take an argument to a finance director as much as anybody else. Increasingly, that becomes a hard criterion, as you look at very big, very successful challengers that still have failed to make money for a succession of years, but are the darling of Wall Street. That third criterion has become harder and harder to live with.
Two quick follow-up questions on that. Am I right that it's possible to be a challenger brand in some way, even if you are the market leader, or is that not possible?
Yeah, I think there's a really interesting question, isn't there, about once a challenger has become number one, what does it do in that situation? And you see people taking two completely different points of view. One is challenger is just a stage you go through, and then you achieve a point of leadership, and at that point you flip into a different kind of behavior. And you start becoming a bit more sort of all things to all people, and you lose some of that edge and lose some of that kind of culture. And you could argue that is entirely the wrong thing to do, that actually the one thing that will keep you number one in what are essentially a lot of very fickle categories all around us is that continued mindset, attitude and culture that's taken you there in the first place. So I was reading only this morning actually about the head of brand at Air New Zealand, who was talking about that they were really important to maintain that challenger mindset and approach even in their core market. So even in New Zealand, where they are number one, they continue and think and act like the challenger because markets change so quickly. They need to have that kind of always agile, slightly paranoid approach to keep them ahead of the competition.
And then another follow-up question on that is just, given you wrote the book 20 years ago, has your definition of challenger brand changed at all?
I think, I wrote the book because the context was very different then from the way it is now. So I wrote it because I had worked on, Virgin Atlantic in the very early days when it was just two planes. I'd worked on the launch of PlayStation in the States when it was inconceivable at the time it could take on Sega and Nintendo and win. I worked on the relaunch of Apple when Steve Jobs came back over in Europe. And I was really interested in why it was that nobody was writing about these kinds of situations. What they were writing about was big brands, like big companies like GE and Coke and IBM, and what we could learn from leadership. And clearly that wasn't the case for most of us. Most of us were in a very different situation. What's happened, as you allude to, over the last 20 years is that suddenly this concept of challenger has almost become the default positioning. And actually, there's a lot of people talking about and writing about kind of a challenger ethos and challenger mindset who aren't actually demonstrating it. And the notion of being a big brand leader has become actually quite unfashionable in terms of what you write and talk about. And even things that I wrote about at the time, like having a belief-led positioning and having a very clear point of view about what you stand for, those things that seemed a province of a small group of kind of iconoclasts then actually sort of seems to default to kind of a normative positioning. So I think what I see happening, I suppose, is as an entirely new context for this conversation, which is it's much more kind of prevalent. Even quite large companies talk about having a challenger mindset and kind of culture. So the question about how you identify and pull apart what is the real challenger approach and real challenger stance within all of that becomes quite important. The second thing I think that's changed is I think people used to understand challenger as about being one brand versus another brand. It's Virgin taking on BA. And I think increasingly, if you look at the challenges over the last 15 years, it's less about challenging somebody and more about challenging something. Warby Parker is challenging the way that the category operates, the notion of the intermediary and that middleman who's kind of artificially inflating the prices for all of you. Airbnb is challenging the way we think about travel and the way we think about participating in a city. It's not challenging Hilton or Sheraton or anything like that. So I think that's the other big change one's seen in how you define challenges.
I see. And so do you feel like some of the ideas from your book were maybe a little bit ahead of their time, or just that the broader world of brand positioning has caught up to some of the things that you presented in your book and they've become more mainstream than they were at the time that you published?
I think the latter. I mean, I think I'm not sure the ideas were ahead of their time because effectively they were simply somebody stepping back and looking at what challenges at that time seemed to encompass. And
right. And I suppose your book sales suggest they weren't ahead of their time. There was some recognition that they were useful then as well.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's more, as you say, that it's become more mainstream. And so really disentangling what it means to be a challenger now, I think, is harder.
I suppose there's a bit of a self-selection bias in your clients that they probably aren't coming to you unless they think of themselves as challenger brands or want to become challenger brands because they've read your book or looked at your website. But broadly speaking, is your goal to make any client that comes to you think like a challenger brand? Or is there even hypothetically a case where you would say, you know what, that's not actually the right approach for you?
We had when we started the company, we had a very arrogant idea that what we would do is actually we'd kind of test clients. We'd ask them a set of questions exactly as you're kind of surmising, which just to see if they were ready. Because our metaphor was that what we were was yeast effectively, and if you take a bread analogy, the bread can't rise unless it's at the right temperature. There's no point in applying a catalyst unless the host is at the right temperature. And it is true that one of the big changes in the question we get asked, so when a client comes to us these days, it's less about, funnily enough, we'd like a challenger strategy. It's more about we'd like a challenger mindset. We'd like a challenger culture. And whereas we used to say, you want a challenger strategy, we'll have to do some cultural work as well. And they'd go, okay, if it gets us to the strategy. Now we have to say, you want a challenger mindset, we have to hang that around something. We have to hang it around some positioning work or a strategy so that we can do the cultural work around that. They'll go, okay, kind of understand that as well. But that does then get you into the question about, are you really in the right place for this? Is your leadership really committed to it? Are you really going to kind of be in a position to carry this through?
You've also identified 10 challenger stances, which I think are broad positioning approaches that challenger brands can take. How do you make use of these with your actual clients? Do you show them all 10 and sort of get into a workshop and try to figure out which one is the best for them?
We use it as a shortcut to make them understand that being a challenger is not about me versus another player. It's about challenging something rather than somebody. And so what we tend to do is choose 4 of them just as examples and say, let's look through each of these 4 lenses in turn and see what it would mean to think like this kind of challenger, and then that kind of challenger, and then the third kind of challenger. And let's see which you feel most comfortable with, which reflects kind of culturally where you've come from or where you could go to, and just try them on for size very quickly. And it's a shortcut that allows them to start to get a sense of the kind of challenger they feel most comfortable being, and then sets the tone really for the much more significant piece of work about how you bring that to life.
And have these 10 stances how stable are they? Have they changed a lot in the past 20 years? Do you occasionally find a new one and add it to the list or kill one off?
Yeah, absolutely right. So it's such an interesting question. So I'm actually rewriting that book at the moment with PhD, who are our partners. And there is an entirely new narrative that's become very important, which is the local hero, for instance. So localness, partly as a rejection of big and global and international, but partly as a celebration of, 4 people around here, 5 people around here, 4 people around here. It's become a really important type of challenger narrative all over the world. So we are introducing that as a narrative and retiring one of the other ones, for instance.
To what degree are these potential brand positions, these stances, how mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive do you consider the list? You just said occasionally there's another stance that you find, but do you feel like there are stances that a brand could take that are maybe in between 2 or 3 of them?
Completely, yeah. I mean, what you tend to find out is that most brands are mostly one stance with a splash of something else. And inevitably, as with all models, it's a slightly artificial forcing apart of the different narratives, but it's useful. All models are wrong, but some are useful, in the words of George Box. It's a useful model, but it's not complete.
Right. And if you're working with a client, once you've discovered such and such a stance is absolutely the right one for this brand, and you've all aligned on that, what do you do next? What do you do with that information to help build or strengthen that brand?
Well, one of the things that's useful, obviously, is to say, okay, well, if that's the kind of neighborhood that we want to be in as a challenger, what are the other kinds of challenges in that neighborhood that we can learn from? And they almost certainly won't be in your category. They'll be from completely different categories. But let's go and look at what they've done in their categories to live that narrative and to make that compelling and true and something that the consumer feels turns into genuine services and products and ideas that they can relate to and buy into. So you then go on a kind of a learning journey from those other categories. And of course, that's always an eye-opener because we spend, as brand owners, much too much time fixated with our own category and doing endless competitive analysis of our own categories if we can learn huge amounts from that, and not enough time looking outside and seeing the opportunities beyond us. So we kind of take them on a kind of journey of intelligent naivety, learning from those other categories, learning from those other brands, and then starting to imagine what would happen if some of those brands were to take over themselves. So let's say this other brand in this other category, which is this narrative, let's say the Feisty Underdog, for the sake of example, if that took over our situation now, what would they do? What would their action plan for the next 3 years be? What are the things that they would do with our assets that we're not doing with our assets? And it's such a simple thing to do, but it's a very invigorating, stimulating way to rethink what you've got in front of you and the potential of it.
And just to carry that example through, can you, not to put you on the spot, but can you think of any examples of the Feisty Underdog so we can kind of think about how you might take advice from what they're doing?
Well, the classic Feisty Underdog at the moment is Wendy's in the US, right? So Wendy's suddenly kind of woke up, a year or so ago, and they suddenly started tugging on the tail of McDonald's in this kind of very entertaining way. That's not simply about attitude and sass, but is about calling them out in terms of having frozen burgers and all sorts of things that Wendy doesn't do, and being quite bold, but always staying just the right size or side of obnoxiousness. And a lot of people, what a lot of people are cautious about in adopting the kind of feisty, kind of underdog kind of narrative in that kind of situation is, well, what happens if the big player starts, responding to us, or what happens if we get on the wrong side of them and their media spend? And so starting to get some confidence and some courage from seeing other people do this before and what kind of line they walked up to and haven't walked over, those become very useful lessons for a brand that wants to walk in those kinds of shoes.
This episode of How Brands Are Built is brought to you by Squad Help, the world's #1 naming platform. Here's how Squad Help works. You launch a naming contest to engage hundreds of naming experts. You're guided through an agency-level naming process that goes beyond traditional crowdsourcing. The platform uses AI and includes name validation features such as audience testing, trademark validation, linguistic analysis, and quality scoring. And Squad Help doesn't just do naming. You can also use their platform for taglines or slogans, as well as logo design. To launch your naming contest today, go to squadhelp.com and start receiving custom name suggestions instantly. Squad Help, company, brand, and business name ideas by experts. Today's episode is also brought to you by Rev.com, offering fast, affordable, accurate audio transcription and captions. I'm actually an experienced user of Rev. I've transcribed episodes of this podcast with their service, but I've also used it in my own brand consulting practice to record and transcribe interviews that I conduct during the discovery phase of a project. I've tried some of the other services out there, and I keep coming back to wanting to use Rev because their transcriptions are extremely accurate. Their turnaround time is less than 24 hours. It's just as fast as I need it to be, and the transcriptions are just $1 per minute. Right now, Rev is offering listeners of this show $10 off your first order. To get your $10 off coupon, visit rev.com/blog/HBAB for How Brands Are Built. Again, that's rev.com/blog/HBAB. Rev, transcriptions made simple. I'm curious what else in your mind goes into a comprehensive brand platform, so to speak. So beyond understanding which challenger stance a brand might take, do you typically at Eat Big Fish, will you write a positioning statement? Will you identify a brand essence and brand personality, all these other terms and categories of ideas that are used traditionally in brand consulting? Where do you sit on all of those?
So there's a chapter in Eating Big Fish which is about having a lighthouse identity that says, yes, obviously positioning is important, but the positioning, as I was saying earlier on, links very much into the internal culture, and it's hard to entirely divorce those two things in a challenger. One influences the other, and vice versa. So we have a model called the Lighthouse Identity, the Challenger Lighthouse Identity, and in that there are some different elements. So there's a framing kind of belief system. This is our perspective about what matters in the world and what matters in this category, and very often that takes a slightly contrarian point of view to what the rest of the category thinks. You know, in a world of X, we believe in Y. We'll have a sense about what the real product offer is in that context. You know, so if that's what we believe, so our real kind of product or service offer is about this. We'll have a sense of how the brand needs to behave. That's less about positioning personality and more about how we're going to behave in the marketplace. It clearly will include some aspects of personality, but goes beyond that, because ultimately how a challenger acts, obviously, rather than simply how they talk, is going to be the thing that really defines what makes them different and their success. And then there'll be a kind of essential kind of thought of what the kind of cause or mission or kind of rallying cry that they're all about consists in.
What process do you think is best for filling that out? Is it a series of, and I know you have some of this content at the end of Eating the Big Fish and maybe some of your other books, but is it a series of workshops, or is it a lot of independent work on the part of an agency to do research around the category, some combination of those two things?
One of the reasons I'm a great believer in workshops is because I think you have to create a culture around the strategy at the same time as developing the strategy itself. So in other words, you need to get all the people who are going to deliver the strategy. So typically we work with a group of, let's say, 25 people. It will include a cross-functional client team, so not simply marketers, but sales, sometimes finance, innovation, PR, communications, a cross-functional mix. It'll include the key business partners. It sometimes includes some intelligently naive people who aren't actually from the category, who are just going to sit there and kind of keep us honest. Typically that might include a researcher, for instance, with a very deep understanding of the consumer, even if they don't have a deep understanding of the brand. And we'll go through a series of workshops that will allow the team to collectively arrive at the solution by looking through various exercises and frameworks that'll kind of push them and test them and develop the ideas and amplify the differences, but allow them to collectively arrive at the solution, so that first of all, they feel they've got their fingerprints all over it, and they feel it's their idea rather than somebody else's idea. And secondly, they'll have started to get an understanding of how we're going to need to work together as a team to give this a chance to live and breathe and succeed. And indeed, when we hit a road bump, because we might well hit a road bump, and it might well come from inside the organization rather than outside the organization, how are we as a team going to respond to that and manage that?
So one of the exercises that you might do in that workshop would be, regardless of what the actual exercise is, but you would be trying to answer a question such as, what is it that we believe about the world or about the category? That was the first kind of element that you identified of the Lighthouse Identity. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. But actually that might be the second question, funny enough, because very often it's easier to get to what you believe by working out what you reject first. So a very good exercise is getting people to think about, from a category point of view, from a brand point of view, what is it that we hate most about this category? What do we reject most? And actually by working out what you hate and reject, and it's amazing the energy that comes out of that. People really love hating, Well, then you can say, okay, well, if that's what we reject, so what is it then that we stand for and what do we believe? That becomes a much easier question to answer.
Okay. And how careful are you about the phrasing of the answers to these questions? I know we've all been in workshops or been doing brand work where it feels like you get to this stage of wordsmithing and people are debating whether there should be a comma there. Do you get down to a final statement? And I'm asking this partly because it was such a large group that you said you bring into the workshop, and consensus gets harder and harder the more people you have in the room.
Yeah, I think it's a brilliant observation. So I think in a workshop, there is a limit to democracy. So what in a workshop you want to get to is energy and direction, and agreement about the direction of travel. You're not going to get complete agreement about exactly what the right set of words is. That's going to happen with a smaller group outside it, that the workshop or the next workshop after that will then align around and agree with. But you're not going to get 25 people to copyright a sentence together. That just isn't going to be a good use of their time.
Right. You mentioned the exercises and the way that you've tried to make challenger brand thinking more substantive, giving a process. I'm just curious, these days, is there a specific exercise that you're especially enjoying using or that you feel like you're getting a lot of value out of? Anything that you would specifically recommend?
I love the hate exercise. The other exercise which is not ours, it's an exercise that it's on YouTube. You can find it. It's the Daniel Kahneman exercise, which is very good, is the pre-mortem. So I don't know if any of your previous people have talked about the pre-mortem exercise.
No, and Daniel Kahneman, the economist.
Yeah, Thinking Fast and Slow. So in it he says, look, this is an exercise essentially about trying to guarantee success of an enterprise. So he says, just before you're about to commit to something, sit down as a group and you're going to imagine a situation 18 months from now where you've done whatever it is we're proposing to do, launch this new positioning in the marketplace, for instance, and it's been a complete disaster. So looking back from that 18-month, in the future retrospective, why was it a disaster? What should we have thought about at that point 18 months ago? And what would you have done differently? And it's a really good way of anticipating what the elephant's in the room, what nobody's talking about. It allows stuff to come out that just says, okay, this is great. So some of you actually aren't entirely comfortable with how far we're going with this idea. Or alternatively, some of you don't think we're going fast enough. You feel that we need, a more concrete product support to be able to launch this. Great. Okay, well, let's put that in place. It's a brilliant exercise for flushing out the kind of preconditions for success before you launch.
I like that both of the exercises you've identified have some degree of negativity toward them. And not just in that sort of negative thinking, but even, I suppose the nature of challenger brand is negative just in terms of identifying what you're not or what you're opposed to.
I think it's very healthy. And we interviewed one of the founders of Urban Outfitters, and he was talking about how in the very early days, they had another brand in the United States. I'm not sure I should mention who they were, but another brand in the United States, another retail brand in the United States, that they wanted to be the complete opposite of. They hated its whole preppy look and the button-down collars and all that kind of stuff. And they said, right, we're going to be the antithesis of this. And they never talked about it to consumers. And actually, after 18 months, they didn't talk about it themselves anymore to themselves. But for the first 18 months, it was like the kind of rocket booster that pulled it out of the gravitational kind of pull of the Earth's field and allowed it to kind of get into free space and then find its own kind of orbit. And I think I'm not sort of suggesting that negativity is, in a prolonged way, good for anybody to live with. But just initially, the energy that you can get from that, just to allow you your own orbit and definition, can be very useful.
Well, I think we all know who that other brand was, but I won't say either. I'd love to get your take on, you mentioned it earlier, but this transition from challenger status to being a market leader. And I suppose now I'm asking this with full knowledge that as a market leader, you can still have that challenger brand ethos. But I'm specifically curious about Apple, just as a brand that, of course, we've all witnessed experiencing incredible growth and success, but really transitioning from the guys who could get away with the 1984 ad and the Think Different ad to being that market leader and so dominant that they could never say anything like that anymore, I don't think. How should it be managed? How do you feel Apple has managed that, either well or not well?
I think when you become a big brand like that, you have to recognize that at the very least, you need to understand where you need to be a challenger and where you need to be a leader. So you look at Amazon, for instance. I think Amazon is a really interesting example of this, isn't it? Amazon is, in a number of places, acting like a challenger. It's being very innovative. It's changing the rules of the category, being very dramatic about the way that it's doing that. And in other areas, it's being like a very big kind of consolidated leader. I think, and if you look at, a large airline, for instance, I was talking to a large national airline last year, and they were saying in our home market, of course, we need to think and behave like a leader. But when we are in, a big European market, we are a challenger in the leisure business, for instance. So we need to understand how to flex between leader behavior and challenger behavior within the same brand. I think the interesting question about Apple is it seems to have lost the ability to do that. So at one level, it's very hard to argue with the commercial value of Apple. They've seemed to have done remarkably well for someone who's forgotten how to be a challenger. At the same time, there seems to be a general sense that unless they start to renew themselves and stop relying on the iPhone business, for instance, and find a way of, when they do launch into new areas, genuinely rediscovering some of that kind of challenger mojo, they're not really going to succeed and compete. If you take that view, then I do think there is a kind of a bit of DNA that they need to rekindle.
So just a couple of wrap-up questions here. We've talked about Apple and some of the things they're not doing well. Are there any brands that you think are doing everything right? And I know that's a high bar, but so we'll leave it at, let's say, 99% of everything right, whether that means they're especially unique or meaningful or bold or consistent.
Well, I think one of the brands I most admire, particularly on this side of the pond, is BrewDog. So BrewDog, as you know, is a brand that was launched, it's a beer brand, launched out of Scotland, again in 2008. And I think what's interesting is how they've managed constraints brilliantly, how they've turned the natural constraints that many challengers face, and they've turned them into an advantage. So very famously, of course, they couldn't get any funding from the banks to launch because people, for some reason, in 2008 didn't seem inclined to lend money to a small Scottish brewer. They thought there were enough brewers already out there. So they set up the whole equity for punks thought. So they went and got their users effectively to fund them. And that created not only the financial pool without people from banks leaning over their shoulder and telling them how to spend it and not to spend it, but also created this incredible bond between them and their users. They recognized that they didn't have a big marketing budget, so they did this series of really iconically bold moves from, the world's strongest beer to brewing beer underwater called Sunk Punk. At the time of the Olympics, they launched a beer called Never Mind the Anabolics that included every banned substance in the Olympics in it. They had a range called The End of History, which was beer bottles stuffed in roadkill. So they just did a series of really extraordinary PR initiatives in the guise of innovation that got everybody in the UK interested in what they were doing, got all the media keen to interview the founders, and in their words, created a platform for them to talk about why they think that beer doesn't have to start with Heineken and end with Stella. So it created this platform to get their points of view about. They've then gone on and they created a TV show, BrewDogs in the States. They've created a beer hotel with, beer on tap in your room should you want that. They've just been masters of using the constraints that they've had to actually make them better marketers, more vivid, more exciting as a brand than anybody else. And they've maintained that momentum for 10 years. I think that's a really remarkable thing to have done.
That's great. And I know that one of your other books, A Beautiful Constraint, speaks to that sort of idea of how those constraints can inspire creativity and innovation.
I agree. And I think actually that's a very exciting thing for us, to be honest, as a human species and a civilization, as we face into some quite profound constraints that we're all going to have. I think it's very exciting to learn from them and recognize, actually, you know what, this could be better this way rather than worse. This is not going to limit us. This could simply open a new door to a new possibility, and let's embrace that.
Right. Well, if BrewDogs can solve climate change, I will drink to that.
That's next year, I think. Yeah, exactly.
As an author, other than your own books, what are some branding or business books that you recommend? So something you've read recently, maybe, or just a classic that has really informed your whole approach?
Oh, wow. I love books, funnily enough, about the classics. I love books that are about brands that existed and built themselves before there was mass media advertising and communication, for instance, or indeed the very early days. So that I think the kind of godparent of all challenges is really Avis, because they were the first to make being number two cool. And there's a fantastic story in that about the night before DDB, which was the agency, presented the we're number two, so we try harder campaign. Before they presented that for the first time to Avis, there was an argument in the agency between the account team and the creatives, and the account director on the business tried to kill the idea of we're number two, so we tried harder, because they felt it was un-American. They felt that America was all about winning, and nobody's going to celebrate being number two. And I think, A, that's a fabulous story. B, it shows that actually these kinds of campaigns and these kinds of ideas don't just naturally come and everybody recognizes they're brilliant. There's lots of internal fighting that you have to push through to kind of get there. And secondly, just for me as a champion of challenges, it just shows how far the world has come, because you could argue that we've completely flipped now. We love the underdog, and we love the scrappy challenger, and that's become as much a part of the American culture as our own culture. And that's a big, big sea change in the way we see the world.
Is there, just out of curiosity, is there a book about that DDB campaign or anything that someone could turn to if they wanted to learn more?
There is. That particular book is out of print, but the CEO of Avis at the time, he wrote a couple of great books. One was called Up the Organization, and he wrote a follow-up to that as well, which was really about very revolutionary challenger cultural thinking in 1962, 1963, and it's just a cracking read even now.
Great. I'll look that up. Last question. What advice do you give young people who are interested in becoming brand strategists or getting into brand consulting?
I think you've got to have an angle. I've got a friend in the States who's a writer and has been a journalist and writes speeches, called Paul Pendergrass. And he has a model, which he calls scoop, angle, voice. And essentially it says that if you're writing a story, there are three things you can have. So the first is you can have a scoop. You can notice something happening that nobody has reported on before. But very few people can have a scoop, right? Very few people get a scoop ever in their lives as marketers or brands or kind of journalists. The second thing you can have is an angle. You can have a perspective on that story that nobody's had before. So you can have a view about why it happened or what should happen as a result of it or that kind of thing. And most great journalism is about people taking a very particular and very distinctive angle. And the third is you can have a voice. You can have a kind of a depth and a kind of robustness with the way you discuss it that nobody's decided. I'm very struck by, in the consultancy business, how few people have an angle. I'm struck by how in the agency business, how few advertising agencies who spend all their time advising clients about brand positioning, how few of them have an angle. They don't. They talk about ideas. We believe in great ideas. Well, everybody believes in great ideas. What's your angle? So I think have an angle and stick to it, and actually then do the research around it that gives you confidence and authority and a kind of mandate to pursue it. It's such a simple and obvious idea. It's startling how little it happens.
That's great. It also seems like an analogy for just brand positioning in general, right? That you could have a scoop. You could literally be creating a category, having a product that nobody has seen before. But as you said, few brands or businesses really have that. So is the angle in your mind similar to just positioning or challenger brand thinking?
I think that absolutely is right. I think most challengers actually don't scoop. They have a unique angle on a category or a product but a product usage, and that's how they break through.
Great. So what's good for the brand is good for the brander, I suppose. We'll leave it there. Adam, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me, and I hope we can connect again soon.
Love to. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to How Brands Are Built. If you liked the episode, please leave a rating and review and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. To learn more about Adam, visit eatbigfish.com, where you can find more information about his consulting practice, as well as Eating the Big Fish and his other books. I'll also post my notes from this interview along with any relevant links and images and a full transcript at howbrandsarebuilt.com. While you're there, you can read related blog posts and sign up for our occasional newsletter about all things branding. How Brands Are Built is a production of Heirloom Agency, LLC. Our theme music is by Isha Erskine Project. I'm Rob Meyerson, and I'll talk to you next time.